months ago I had a dream. I dreamt that there were a large collection of people from all walks of life looking upwards towards some beams of light coming from the sky. Some of these people were famous. Some of them were just generic people that you'd never notice even in the street. Some were devoutly Christian. Others followed other faiths. And then there were the mystical, magical kinds, or the really talented musicians, people who were really good looking or kind of funny looking and quirky. Some were in love, some were single, some were young, some were old, all different kinds of people. There was even an unworldly creature somewhere in the middle of that mix. But what were they looking up towards? Were they looking up the beams that were headed up towards UFOs? Or was it something more spiritual in nature? I painted the dream that I had. And the funny thing is, people always assume that this is a painting of an alien abduction. But what if aliens were not really aliens? What if they were something else? What if we have completely used our mortal confines of what it is that we understand to be true to define something that's actually entirely different? The next 3 videos are going to be part 1, 2, and 3 of a single topic related to the experiences of one man and what those experiences might actually teach us about humanity and our lives and our perspectives. The person I'm talking about is Chris Bledsoe. You may believe him, you may not, but if you don't, I urge you to stick with me because I don't think it's quite what you might think it to be. The story of Chris Bledsoe and his experiences fly in the face of what we believe is out there and what we believe people see when they see what is out there. I've done around 12 to 15 hours of watching Chris being interviewed by a variety of different people and additional research to sort of get to the bottom of some of the topics that are being discussed in his interviews. And I have a lot of questions. So this part 1 is going to be a background introduction to the experiences of Chris Bledsoe. Part 2 is going to be a tarot reading to explore the credibility of his claims. And part 3 is going to relate to a prophecy or a series of predictions that come out of his story. Bear with me, because if nothing else, this is going to be a test of what you already believe, and I think you're going to find it interesting. I came across a story about a fellow, and I actually put a quiz or a poll on the community tab of both of my channels. And I just mentioned his name and asked whether people knew who I was talking about. These are the results. On the Ellie Dreams Down Under channel, 1,000 people approximately voted on this. The question was, Chris Bledsoe, is he credible and you believe him? Is he not credible and talking nonsense? Are you undecided, or is it that you have no idea who he is? YouTube only tells me in the 1,000 blocks, so somewhere in the 1,000 blocks. So over 1,000 people responded, and 91% of people had no idea who Chris Bledsoe is. 1% of those people, so 10 people approximately, said they didn't find him credible. 4% said that they did, and 3% really didn't know. I know that quite a number of people would have done some research because 91% had no idea who Chris was, and they would have done some research to try and figure out who he is before they answered the question. And after finding a video or looking him up on Google or something and finding out that he's written a book, they may have made their decision based on that. Let me tell you what the other channel produced in results here. So a much smaller channel, because the Universe channel has only really just started recently. 118 people voted. 86% had no idea who Chris Bledsoe was. Of the people who did know of him, once again, 1%, found him not credible. So that's around about 1 to 2 people. 5% found him credible and said they believe him, and 8% said they were undecided. By virtue of the nature of the Universe channel, the fact that there was more people who'd heard of him and slightly more people who were either undecided or thought he was credible is relevant to the channel. It's just that it attracts a different kind of audience. And so I understood that the slight deviation or the slight difference there was related to that. Over the Christmas holiday period, I started looking at whatever I could find on Chris Bledsoe. And I'm going to tell you what I know of his story in a moment. I have now watched somewhere in the vicinity of 12 to 15 hours of interview relating to Chris. Either he is being interviewed or a variety of different members of his family are being interviewed. And honestly, about 12 to 15 hours worth of this. He's recently written a book, and Chris's book is called UFO of God. It talks about his recollections and the events surrounding an experience that he had in his life, actually multiple experiences. I haven't read the book yet. I am intending to write the book. Not write the book. I'm intending to read the book. I'm not going to write it because I find this family in particular very different to the famous or well-documented experiences that you see, being interviewed over and over again by various different content creators and podcasters and things like that, and news stations. I'm going to tell you now, I was not sure what to make of Chris Bledsoe until I saw him do a very brief interview with Jesse Waters on Fox News. I think it's like a 3-minute interview. And that's when it finally sunk in that this is something interesting. But you have to watch it on the big TV screen in order to be able to understand what I'm talking about. There was Jesse Waters on the left and Chris Bledsoe on the right. Jesse Waters was very well prepared. He'd had his facial, had his makeup on, his hair was perfect. He was wearing an immaculate suit. You could tell he probably had a manicure and a pedicure and a massage and everything to prepare for his day, like he probably always does. And he was the shiny one on the left. And then we had this very ordinary man, very soft-spoken, sort of reserved kind of appearing man on the right, who had done nothing to prepare for the interview other than show up. And with all of the preparation on the left and the lack of preparation on the right, the person who came across as credible in that interview was Chris Bledsoe. I will leave a link to that Fox News interview, which is only 3 minutes long, in the description box of this video. Not for the interview content, because I'm going to give you far more information than that in this video, but so that you can see the comparison between the two men, because that was when a light bulb went off, and that's when I really started to get interested in Chris Bledsoe. So before I do a reading, because I'm going to do a reading on Chris Bledsoe today, let me tell you what I know about his story. The story is very complex, so I'm not going to tell you everything. I probably will cut this into a number of different episodes. But in this particular episode, I'm going to tell you his early story that I'm aware of. When Chris was around about 10 years old, he grew up in the South, gun culture. As a 10-year-old, he went out with his friends to do some hunting. And as you can imagine, as a 10-year-old, he got shot during that hunting expedition. And he had like a near-death experience. So he nearly died. He still has the wounds from that gunshot injury, which I think either went into his back or even through his back. He's got a big scar like this. But he had a near-death experience. I don't know whether he recalls anything from that experience specifically, but he nearly died. Thankfully, he was revived and saved and continued to live. And then he grew into an adult and he became quite a wealthy home builder. At any given period of time, I think he had 4 children that I can find at the moment in the research that I've been doing. And he's been married for a number of years. And as a home builder, he became quite wealthy. over, the course of his career. I think he built and supplied homes for the military and also other types of contracts. And at any given time, he had between 70 and 120 homes on the go. Now, he didn't pay cash to have all of this done. He would take a variety of business loans out to be able to keep things moving. And so he always had this overlap of debt and profit and things that he was working with. When 2011 and the Twin Towers attack took place, or 9/11 took place, there was a big shock to the system, particularly in government housing. And I'm not sure how it works specifically because this is not an industry that I'm in and I'm not in the United States. But I've seen Chris describe this on a number of occasions. He said that the market basically crashed in that respect. And by around between 2001 and 2004, he began to see his business dwindle to the point where not only could he not maintain the business debts that began to crash, and people were not buying these homes, or the contracts were not there for the homes, but also his cash flow diminished to such a degree that at one point he had sunk so low that he was having trouble finding money to be able to allow his children to buy their lunch at school. That is a massive crash for a person who used to, from what I understand, have 15 dirt bikes in the garage and a number of homes and all, expensive cars and never needed for anything. The crash was really dramatic. Now, Chris and his family lived on acreage. They had a large property next to Chris's father's large property as well. And they continued to live in that place, but they became very cash poor and were unable to meet their debt requirements. Chris also started to suffer from a variety of different symptoms. I think he'd been struggling for a number of years, and ultimately he was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And it was getting to the point where his physical health was extremely bad, and also his finances and his ability to be able to provide for his family was very, very bad. Chris and his wife were devout Christians, and they had raised their children to be devout Christians as well. I think that the children ranged in age from around about 10 to about 18 at around about, actually maybe even slightly younger, from around 10 to about 14 or 15 at around about this time. Now, Chris was typically Southern. He kept his feelings to himself a lot. He was a very reserved, very dignified kind of personality. And he didn't often wail and moan about his problems to other people, but he felt them very much deep inside, and his family was struggling. But he kept up appearances. And he was also taking medication for his Crohn's disease, or the symptoms that he was suffering. And it appears that there was a point in time in around about 2004, if I'm getting my facts right, where he was hospitalized because he overdosed on his prescription medication. The doctor that was treating him was an over-medicator, and as it transpires, this particular doctor had died from over-medicating himself, but also had caused hospitalization of around about 113 of his patients that Chris is aware of, because Chris, it turns out, was 113th of those patients. Now, he almost died again, or he did die and have a near-death experience once again at that adult age in around about 2004. And the reason why I mention that, because he seems to think that it's part of the story and that it's relevant. And so I'm considering that if that's the way he believes it should be, then that's the way it should be. And so it could very well be that as an individual who's had two near-death experiences, one as a child and one as an adult, plus this extreme high and extreme low, this may be relevant to his story. As a devout Christian, having gone through all of these tough times, having experienced a tremendous low of almost dying, or at least dying for a moment, and having potentially lost everything, and going from being wealthy and successful to really poor, and also suffering from such chronic health problems, he was praying and praying and praying to the God that he understood from the church for a number of years. and his prayers were becoming more and more desperate as his life was becoming more and more desperate. He found himself unable to really engage with life in the same way that his friends were engaging, but he went through the motions. And on one of these occasions, he went fishing with I think his oldest son, who's also called Chris, although the order of the children I'm not entirely sure of yet. Maybe one day I'll get to speak to one of the family members and we can figure it all out. But Chris Sr. and Chris Jr. went on this fishing trip, plus a variety of brother-in-laws and cousins and things and some friends. I think it was all men. They had a camp site set up, and this was like a fishing trip. And the men and the boys were all together. Anyway, I think there were about 6, maybe 8 of them in total. They were sitting by the campfire, I think, and all of the men and the boys were, comparing stories and probably having a drink and, doing whatever they were doing, roasting marshmallows, whatever, or sausages or whatever it is they were cooking on the campfire. And Chris just couldn't engage. He had been in the doldrums and feeling, as though everything is a waste. And he just wanted to get a moment of fresh air. He said to everyone, look, I'm just going to take a walk. I'll be back in a few minutes. I'm just going to go and have a little walk. So he got up and from the campsite and he walked into, the natural space, a wooded area or something like that. He was gone a few minutes. And then while he was out there, he saw a red, fiery kind of light in the sky. And at first he thought it was the sun, except then he saw a second one. And when he saw a second one, he started to feel as though he'd passed into this space where he may not be safe. So he became fearful. And he turned around to run back to where he'd come from. But he said that he made the mistake of turning back for a moment just to sort of see what it was that was behind him. And he saw a third ball of light. And at that precise moment, he doesn't recall anything until later when he found himself walking into the campsite. Now, his first urge when he walked into the campsite and he saw that there was some people there that had been there before was to proclaim, hey guys, you're not going to believe what I just saw. Because he thought that he had just walked into the campsite after being gone for a few minutes and that he'd seen these weird balls of light and then had managed to get away and was about to tell his story. But as soon as he started to attempt to tell his story, the people who were there said, listen, we don't know what you're talking about, but we've had a search party out there looking for you. You've been gone for hours. Now, Chris said that this didn't compute for him because he didn't understand it that way. He thought that he'd been gone for a maximum of 20 minutes. But his friends said that they had actually called around. They'd tried to find him. His son had gone looking for him. His son, Chris, also apparently had an experience. But I'm not going to go into that detail because I don't know a tremendous amount about it. All I know is that Chris Sr. has actually mentioned it a number of times. But the son had gone looking for him. Some of the other men had gone looking for him. And they couldn't find him. He was gone. He was just gone. Anyway, Chris now has had some regression therapy. And this is professional regression therapy that was ordered by the government. So it was actually a professional, highly regarded government hypnotist that was either contracted by the DOD or NASA or the CIA, I don't know, because Chris has had contact with all of those agencies since he began telling his story. And he went through a regression process and they discovered that he had what they believe is around 4 hours of missing time, where they were able to kind of fill it in through this regression hypnosis session. But at the time, he just knew that he saw something that looked like balls of light in the sky, and that his recollection of time was different to that of the people who'd been looking for him. Anyway, they went home, and these balls of light, which he now refers to as orbs, followed him home. At least that's how he feels. He and his son Chris both experienced these orbs once they got back to their home. In fact, for the next couple of years, the entire family began to experience phenomenon of some kind. Now, Chris didn't say anything. I think he may have told a couple of immediate people. There were others in the party that did see, in the fishing party, that did see things, but it didn't appear that whatever it was that had been encountered had followed them home. For Chris and his family, the phenomenon did follow them home. But he told a couple of people, but he was very much involved in this church, a very traditional, God-fearing, religious-based church that followed the Bible, believed that everything that exists is explained in the Bible. There's nothing outside of the Bible that is relevant. And once he started to share his story locally, he found that he was experiencing a tremendous amount of backlash from his friends, the people that he'd grown up with, that he'd gotten to know through his association with the church. They believed through the teaching of Christianity that seeing something in the sky like an orb or a ball of light in the sky is evidence of Satan. And if you're involving yourself with something like that, then you've communicated with Satan, because it's just the way it's taught. And Chris was trying to explain that at the time he was out there praying, and that he doesn't believe that he could have manifested some kind of contact with Satan by talking directly to God, or attempting to talk directly to God. And so there was sort of a mismatch there. Chris began to feel as though he was being vilified, as though he was being treated like someone who had fallen off the path and was headed towards the devil and hell, as opposed to Christianity and heaven, or Jesus in heaven. And so he kind of began to sort of have a falling out. And so what he decided was that he was going to keep this encounter to himself, which he did do. He kept it to himself for around about 10 months. He didn't tell anyone outside of his immediate family, because of the fact that whenever he had told someone, the reception was so starkly negative and almost finger pointing towards him as having done something wrong and being in some way connected to something evil, which he couldn't understand, because he actually found it to be a big question mark himself, because he had been praying. In fact, he'd been praying so convulsively and so so much, because he was desperate at that time, and he thought that prayer was the only thing he had going for him that could potentially help him and his family. And so he'd been obsessively praying over the course of a number of months. And his understanding was that through prayer comes God or Jesus. So this was just completely unknown to him. It was after around about 10 months of not telling anyone, but being in an environment where these orbs were continuously hovering around the home, and also other unusual phenomena were taking place. Chris, I don't know the details of it specifically. I've seen pockets of interview with the 12 to 15 hours of interview that I've been watching, where Chris talks about having a flash where he'd see beings. His children would see beings. And they also would encounter orbs almost every night outside their home. Some of the family members would only see the orbs in the evening. Other family members would also see them during the day. I think Chris Jr. is the only member of the family who's actually seen orbs during the day. And it also got to the point where Chris Sr., the father, was able to sort of invoke the orbs by praying and wishing them and willing them to appear, in which they did. So this went on, and then after about 10 months it all became a little bit too much, and he decided he was carrying a really heavy burden on his shoulders and he wanted to release it. And so he went onto the MUFON website, which is the Mutual UFO Network website, and he put in a report, because apparently the website has an option for you to report a sighting of something unexplained. And so, being in the mortal mindset that we're in, where he thought that he'd seen something unexplained in the sky, that, an unidentified flying object would fall within the category of MUFON. And so he put a report in there of what he'd seen, and I guess he must have gone into some detail and provided his contact information. A week or so went by and nothing happened, but he felt that a great weight had been lifted off his shoulders just for reporting it and putting it out there. After a week or so, people started to contact him. And the people were a little bit unexpected. He had contact from people from MUFON, and so basically these are volunteers who are interested in investigating UFO phenomena, and they will go and they will conduct an investigation. They might be believers who want to validate the investigation, or they might be skeptics who want to kind of debunk it in some way. But he also was starting to get contact from members of the government. So the agencies that I'm aware of that actually contacted him, and they continue to contact him now, even though this took place about 17 years ago, are the Department of Defense, NASA, and the CIA. There are other agencies that I think he's also been contacted by and continues to get contact by, but I can't recall them all. And of course, I'm not the one who actually experienced this story. I'm trying to fill you in on what I've seen in the 12 to 15 hours of video watching that I've been doing over the holidays. Those are the three agencies I remember. On one particular occasion, a fellow from NASA drove for 12 hours unannounced to come to their home and happened to pick a time when Ryan Bledsoe, who was the second son, I think, of the family, so a little bit younger than Chris Jr., was home alone. Some of the kids were in high school, some of the kids were in grade school, but he was somewhere in the middle. And so he was the first one home sometimes, or he had a different school holiday schedule or something. But I remember him stating in one of his interviews that he was home alone and everyone else was either out at work or at school. And a man came and knocked on the door, and his name was Hal. And he was a very unassuming fellow, kind of just wearing corduroy and a cardigan kind of thing. And he even pronounced the family name wrong. I think he called it Bledsoe or something. And he said, I'm here to talk to Mr. Bledsoe. Is he home? And he goes, you mean Bledsoe? No, that's my dad. He's not here. And he goes, well, I'm Hal something or other. I'm from NASA. And I wanted to talk to him about his experience. So, of course, Ryan, who probably was around about 15 or something at the time, was pretty impressed with the term NASA. And so he called his dad and said, there's a man from NASA here to see you. And Chris said, just keep him company until I get home, and I'll come home and talk to him. And so Ryan met with this fellow from NASA, and they chatted. And that fellow, Hal, continued to be in contact with the Bledsoe family for the rest of his life. He started off the story from the Bledsoe family is that Hal approached as a kind of a potential inquisitive kind of friend from NASA, but they now understand that he was there to debunk the story, to see whether or not, actually not exactly to debunk, but to investigate it, test it out, to see if he could find any holes in the family's story. But he was very clever in the way that he did it. He kind of pretended to be a bit dippy and pretended to be a bit forgetful and deliberately, pronounced the name wrong and was very self-deprecating and kind of a softly kind of approach so that he wouldn't appear too uppity or too clever or anything like that. Turns out he was a very extraordinarily clever man and quite the covert operative. When he discovered over the course of time that he couldn't find any holes in the family's story, he continued to stay with the family and they became friends. And he continued to be a family friend for the rest of his life. He ultimately died. I think he slipped and fell when he was of quite advanced age and had an accident and eventually passed away as a result of that. But he was recalled with quite a bit of fondness actually by the Bledsoe family. And they, as time went on, realized that the first contact that he had made with the family was to kind of slip himself in there in a sneaky way and figure out if they were legitimate or not. Turns out he thought that they were legitimate. Now, Chris Bledsoe in the past 17 years has developed a reputation for being the most carefully scrutinized and heavily documented and investigated person relating to unexplained phenomena and potentially UFOs. I've seen his story so many times that one thing I can say with confidence is he's not a UFO experiencer. He's not a person who believes himself to be a UFO experiencer. He describes it very differently, and he's had a number of encounters since then. One of them particularly of interest to me because it coincides with lots of things I've been doing readings on. Chris considers himself to be an experiencer of something spiritual and almost like a messenger or a conduit for a divine sort of source of spiritual wisdom that uses him to tap into the human race. It's very difficult for me to be able to describe this in a short description because remember, I've watched hours of interview with Chris, and he goes into the story and his family goes into the story with so much more detail that help you to understand how big this story actually is. It is potentially huge. In 2012, Chris had another encounter. He's had numerous encounters, but one of the most relevant, notable encounters was in 2012, and it was with a female entity that is very similar to the female entity that supposedly abducted and took on a big joyride through the universe and the planetary systems back in the 1980s. In The Universe Always Wins, one of the very first videos is relating to a book called, I think it's called Abduction to the Ninth Planet. And the person who appeared as a sort of an apparition for this French man living in Australia, in a rural area of Australia. One night, in the middle of the night, he woke up, he went out into his garden, and there was this beautiful, impossibly beautiful woman standing there. And she was an alien-ish type of character with a shimmering appearance and so divinely beautiful that it's not even possible to describe her. And she took him on a trip to learn and then share the message of a variety of different things. Well, this woman, this female creature that Chris Bledsoe said came to him in 2012, was very similar in the way that he describes her. She just wasn't quite so big as the other one. And she appeared as a bull, and then she appeared as in a female form, but slightly elevated from the ground and shimmering, wearing top to toe white, almost a Roman type of dress. And she was impossibly beautiful, made of almost like a translucent kind of shimmering substance of some kind. She told him that humanity had a burden to bear and that everything would be revealed when certain things fall into place. I'm going to be looking at that specifically because I've been doing research trying to figure out when and where and what is it that she's talking about, and I think I'm close. So look out for that in a different video. You never know, I might even get one of the Bledsoes to come and say it for themselves if I can convince them to come and meet with me. I'd really like to meet with someone from the family to talk about this. When I put all of this together, Chris is a really fascinating fellow. The fact that he's written this book called UFO of God, and the preface for the book is written by someone from the CIA. There is messaging that I've been able to get from the family that coincides with some of the human ascension readings that I've been doing. And that's the reason why I'm taking so much interest in this particular story. Because I recently did a reading relating to human ascension that focused on the topic of world order. And this shimmering woman from 2012 that came to talk to Chris Bledsoe said something almost identical to my reading. And when he recounted it, or when his son Ryan actually recounted it in a recent video, I kind of stopped for a moment and thought to myself, yeah, this sounds just like that reading that I did the other day. It's almost identical. The message that the woman came to share was that there are forces at the top of the world here somewhere, human forces, more powerful than anyone else, who are trying to suppress the truth for their own benefit. And they're actually rolling out this disclosure topic in a way that's going to be formatted to suit them. And generally it's going to be fear-based in order to keep us under control. But the truth is very different. And the truth is going to be revealed. And it's going to be revealed at a specific time in a specific way to counter what this human element is going to try and propagate. And that's exactly what appeared in my reading, my human ascension readings from a few weeks ago. That was the end of part 1 of this series. Part 2 is going to air tomorrow and will be a tarot reading where I'm exploring the question of Chris Bledsoe and his story, looking at it from the perspective of what this story might actually be, whether it's credible, whether it's real, and what it might actually be relating to and why he is the focus of this story. Hope you'll join me then. This is Ellie Dreams Down Under. Thank you so much for watching. I love knowing you're here, and I'll see you in my dreams. Bye.